Hello and welcome back to the History 2020 lecture series here at East Tennessee State University. In the lecture today, I want to talk about the Second World War and the impact it had on the United States, on the home front, as well as on the battlefield. Specifically, we'll look at how war mobilization transformed the American economy and government. We'll also consider the major effects of World War II on American minorities and on women. We'll discuss the major aspects of Allied military strategy in Europe as well as in Asia. We'll also look at the wartime diplomacy among the Allied forces during the war. We'll examine the top-secret Manhattan Project and the effects of the creation of an atomic bomb. Finally, we'll address the changes the war brought to the United States, as well as the new challenges the country faced in the post-war world. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor embroiled the United States in a global conflict that would transform the nation's social and economic life, not to mention its position in international affairs. Overall, the Second World War would become the most destructive conflict in history. Over 50 million deaths resulted. Two-thirds of those were civilian deaths. New weapons were developed such as rockets, jet airplanes, napalm, and the atomic bomb, just to name a few. The war was also used to carry out mass genocide, as the Nazis systematically murdered over 6 million Jews and others who were deemed racially inferior. The physical destruction was also unprecedented. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, nations were dismembered, and millions of people were displaced. So let's talk about how the mobilization transformed the American economy. American entry into the war ended the long public debate over isolation, and as the country went into war production, it ended the long economic depression. The attack on Pearl Harbor triggered an unprecedented mobilization of American resources. Americans were fully aware that it would take all the country's strength in order to wage a two-front war, one in the Pacific and one in Europe. Yet time was of the essence since Japanese and German troops were on the move. On December 18, 1941, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which gave the President far-reaching authority to recognize and create government agencies, regulate business and industry, and even the power to censor the mail and other forms of communication. The War Production Board, created in 1942, directed the conversion of industrial manufacturing to war production. For instance, in 1941, there were more than 3 million automobiles manufactured in the United States. During the next 4 years, only about 140 automobiles would be manufactured. Instead, automobile plants began manufacturing tanks and airplanes. Military-related production skyrocketed from 2% of the nation's economy to 40% by 1943. The United States spent more than $360 billion to defeat the Axis, 10 times the cost of World War I. And to cover the war's costs, Congress passed the Revenue Act in 1942. Under this legislation, it raised tax rates and increased the number of taxpayers. For instance, in 1939, only about 4 million people filed tax returns. This constituted about 5% of the workforce. The new act made 75% of the workforce a taxpayer. So by the end of the war, nearly 90% of workers were paying income taxes. Also beginning in 1943, the payroll deduction system automatically withheld income taxes from wages and salaries. Tax revenues covered part of the military expenditures, while the sale of war bonds also raised revenue to help fight the war. Buying a war bond gave civilians a sense of involvement in the distant war. In all, by the end of the war, the national debt was about 6 times what it had been at the start of the war. The size of the government also grew. The number of federal workers increased from 1 million to 4 million. Suddenly, jobs were now plentiful. The nation's unemployment rate dropped to 14% in 1940, and remarkably to 2% in 1943. But poverty didn't disappear. The war did create a booming economy, but there still was poverty that was in existence in the country. The war raised fears of inflation as consumer goods grew scarce. In 1942, Congress authorized the Office of Price Administration to set price ceilings. With prices frozen, basic goods had to be allocated through rationing, with coupons distributed for items such as sugar, butter, coffee, gasoline, automobile tires, and meat. The government promoted patriotic thrift with massive public relations campaigns that circulated posters with slogans like, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without." Americans endured rationing as well as measures such as Meatless Tuesdays. Americans ate imitation chocolate that tasted like soap, and they used soap that didn't lather. Americans formed carpools, they planted victory gardens, and they recycled. For instance, children in many neighborhoods went around collecting scrap metal for recycling in helping the war effort. In making the United States the so-called Great Arsenal of Democracy, the Roosevelt administration transformed the economy into the world's most efficient military machine. By 1945, the year the war ended, the United States would be manufacturing half of the goods produced in the world. This sort of economic phenomenon transformed American society, allowing millions to be employed in the war industries. So now let's look at how the war transformed the roles of women as well as other minorities. The war marked an important watershed in the status of women. With millions of men going into the military service, the demand for civilian workers changed old prejudices about gender roles in the workplace and in the military. Nearly 200,000 women served in non-combat roles in the Women's Army Corps, the WACS, and the Navy's equivalent, the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, or the WAVES. Other women joined the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and the Army Air Force. Nearly 6 million women entered the workforce during the war, which was an increase of more than 50% overall, and in manufacturing alone, an increase of 110%. Before the war, most female wage earners had been young and single. One important feature of this new labor force was the presence of older married women who were working. 75% of the new women workers were married, 60% were over the age of 35, and more than 33% had children under the age of 14. They tended blast furnaces, operated cranes, drove taxis, welded ship hulls, loaded shells, and many other previously male-dominated jobs. On the Pacific Coast, more than one-third of all workers in aircraft and shipbuilding were women. Rosie the Riveter, dressed in her overalls and holding a pneumatic gun, became the symbol of the wartime female worker. Some still disapproved, as one male legislator bemoaned the fact that if women went to work, there would be no one to, quote, do the cooking, the washing, the mending, and who will rear and nurture the children. Funds for federal child care centers covered fewer than 10% of defense workers' children. Terms like 8-hour orphans and latchkey children described unsupervised children left to take care of themselves. However, many women were eager to get away from the grinding routine of domestic life. One female welder remembered that her wartime job was, quote, the first time I had a chance to get out of the kitchen and work in industry and make a few bucks. This was something I never dreamed would happen. The war also changed the lives of many minority groups in the United States. While Americans were fighting overseas for freedom and democracy, racism in the United States still existed. African Americans overwhelmingly participated in the war effort, despite the racism they encountered. In 1941, the armed forces were the most racially polarized institution in the nation. Yet about 1 million African Americans served in all branches of the military and all fronts during the war, but they served in racially segregated units. Every Army camp and Navy base had segregated facilities and frequent racial incidents. At least 50 black soldiers died in racial conflicts during the war. Yet African Americans did serve their country with distinction. Among the most famous African American servicemen were the nearly 600 pilots trained at Tuskegee, Alabama. The so-called Tuskegee Airmen ended up flying more than 1,500 missions during the war. Their excellent service prompted military and civilian leaders to integrate the armed forces after the war. African Americans also found it difficult to gain equal treatment in the war industries. Blacks who were hired often were limited to the lowest paid, lowest skilled jobs. Some black leaders refused to accept such racist practices. For instance, in 1941, A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, planned a march on Washington, D.C. to demand an end to racial discrimination in the defense industries. The Roosevelt administration agreed to issue a presidential order forbidding discrimination in the war industries in return if Randolph would agree to call off the demonstration. More than 500,000 African Americans left the South for better opportunities during the war years, and more than 1 million blacks nationwide joined the industrial workforce for the first time. African American newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier urged black Americans to promote civil rights while also supporting the war effort. It was called the Double V campaign because the newspaper published 2 interlocking V's with the theme Democracy, Victory at Home, Victory Abroad. The campaign encouraged blacks to support the war effort while fighting for civil rights and racial equality at home. Other minorities, such as Mexican Americans, took part in the war efforts as well. In 1942, the United States government created the so-called Bracero program, whereby the Mexican government agreed to provide seasonal farm workers to the southwestern states. Under this program, some 200,000 Mexican farm workers entered the United States and provided much-needed labor. However, there was some racial prejudice that existed. The increase of Mexican Americans into California prompted many anti-Mexican newspaper editorials and racial confrontations. Even though nearly 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the war with great valor, earning a higher percentage of Congressional Medals of Honor than any other minority group, racism still persisted. There was a constant conflict between Anglo-American servicemen and Mexican-American gang members in Southern California known as zoot suiters. Zoot suits were flashy outfits popular in the 1940s among Mexican-American men. In 1943, several thousand off-duty sailors and soldiers, joined by hundreds of local whites, rampaged through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, assaulting Hispanics and African Americans. The week-long violence came to be called the Zoot Suit Riots. Native Americans also supported the war effort, maybe more so than any other minority group in American society. Native American men served in the armed forces and worked in defense-related industries, and many of them had distinguished records in the military. Perhaps the most distinctive activity was their service as code talkers. Every branch of the military used Native Americans, especially the Navajos, to quickly encode and decipher messages using ancient Indian languages which were unknown to the Germans and the Japanese. The attack on Pearl Harbor ignited vengeful anger toward the people of Japanese descent living in the United States, known as Nisi. Extreme hostility felt toward the Nisi culminated in an executive order, 9066, which was issued on February 19, 1942. This executive order was one of the worst violations of civil liberties in U.S. history, as nearly 112,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes on the West Coast and transported to war relocation camps. The Supreme Court, in the 1944 decision of Korematsu versus the United States, upheld the order as one of military necessity in time of war. More than 60% of the internees were U.S. citizens. They were forced to sell their farms, their homes, their businesses, all at huge losses. The only items they could take were things that they could carry. There was never any evidence that the Japanese Americans constituted any kind of national security threat. And surprisingly, some Japanese Americans served in the military. Volunteers from the internment camps were organized into an all-Japanese American unit. This unit suffered heavy casualties in Europe, and they served their country bravely. Not until 1983 did the government acknowledge this terrible injustice of the internment policy. And then 5 years later, the U.S. government granted $20,000 each in compensation to those who were still living who had spent time in the internment camps, a very small amount relative to what they endured during 4 years of confinement. So now let's discuss the major aspects of Allied military strategy in Europe and in Asia. For months after Pearl Harbor, the news from the Pacific was all bad, to quote Roosevelt. The Japanese, in 3 months after Pearl Harbor, had captured several Allied outposts. This included Guam and the Wake Islands, the Gilbert Islands, and Hong Kong. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines and head towards Australia. The Japanese captured some 12,000 American troops along with 66,000 Filipinos in the early spring of 1942. These prisoners were forced to march 65 miles in 6 days up the Bataan Peninsula. Already malnourished and suffering from tropical diseases, the men were provided with very little water or food. These prisoners were brutalized in what came to be known as the Bataan Death March. Those who fell out of line were beaten, stabbed, or shot, and nearly 10,000 died along the way. When news of this brutality reached the United States, there was much outrage among Americans. The incident only served to increase the animosity towards the Japanese. The Japanese hoped to destroy the U.S. Navy before the United States could totally mobilize, but in the spring of 1942, the United States began to hit back. The U.S. finally halted the Japanese advance toward Australia in two key naval battles. The Battle of the Coral Sea, which took place on May 7th and 8th, 1942, stopped a Japanese fleet advancing toward New Guinea. American warplanes sank a Japanese carrier and destroyed other smaller ships. U.S. losses were high, but the Japanese had much greater losses. Another key naval battle took place at Midway on June 4, 1942. During this battle, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were destroyed. The United States, as a result, was able to effectively break the Japanese momentum in the Pacific. So the Japanese hopes for a short, decisive war were lost after the Battle of Midway. Although America was engaged in a two-front war, a Europe-first strategy was adopted. Initially, the United States wanted to get needed supplies across the Atlantic and open up a second front against Germany in Western Europe. Meeting the first goal required winning the Battle of the Atlantic. For nearly 18 months, the Allied cause looked very grim as German submarines controlled the seas and sank an average of 100 ships a month. The extensive submarine activity illustrates the fierceness of the struggle to control the Atlantic. Finally, during the summer of 1943, the tide began to turn in favor of the Allies. This was due to better air surveillance, improved radar, and breaking the German submarine code. All these things contributed to the Allied success in the Atlantic. The issue of opening a second front in Western Europe was a constant debate among the Allies. After the fall of France and the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Soviets bore the brunt of the war, suffering many casualties. For instance, during the 1943 Battle of Kursk, in this battle alone, the Soviet Army suffered 860,000 casualties, several times what the Allies would suffer for the first 2 months of the European campaign after D-Day. Stalin continually pressed for a British-American landing on the north coast of Europe in order to draw German troops away from the Eastern Front. However, Churchill did not agree. He kept thinking about Dunkirk, and this made him very hesitant to try something so risky with green troops, troops that had never seen battle. Roosevelt worried that if the Allies delayed too much in opening a second front, that this might lead the Soviets to sign a separate peace, as they had during World War I. Churchill and Roosevelt decided to do the next best thing. They launched a campaign into North Africa to establish supply and air bases. Between November 1942 and May 1943, the Allies launched a major counteroffensive in North Africa. Allied troops under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General George S. Patton defeated the German Afrika Korps led by General Erwin Rommel. From Africa, the Allies then followed Churchill's strategy of attacking the Axis through its so-called soft underbelly, that is, by way of Sicily and the Italian peninsula. Italy surrendered on September 8, 1943, but it meant very little because German forces invaded the Italian peninsula and took control. This move saved Mussolini's regime for a time, and it kept the Allies bogged down in a bloody campaign that lasted until the spring of 1945. In 1943, the Allies launched the first major incendiary attack of the war. The bombing raids on Hamburg, which was a major industrial German city, ignited a firestorm that killed 45,000 people and wounded nearly 40,000 others. Germany's aerial attacks during the Battle of Britain during the years 1940 and 1941 had hardened the British views about bombing civilians in Germany. Another incendiary bombing raid would take place in Dresden later in the war. Dresden was the home to many key railroad lines, and during this firebombing, approximately 35,000 Germans died as a result. While the British and the American troops were fighting in North Africa and Italy, the Soviets in the meantime scored a key victory at Stalingrad, a battle that had been raging from between January and February of 1943. Stalingrad proved to be a pivotal battle that turned the tide of the war on the Eastern Front in favor of the Soviet Union. Within a few months, the Soviets would also prevail at Leningrad, ending a German siege of the city which had lasted from September 1941 until January 1944. In late November 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met with Stalin for the first time in Tehran to discuss the Allied strategy for the coming year. They agreed to open the long-awaited Second Front in France within 6 months in return for Stalin's promise to join the fight against Japan. Both sides agreed to the terms, but the long delay in opening the Second Front angered Stalin, and he became increasingly suspicious of American and British intentions. Likewise, Churchill and Roosevelt were very suspicious of Stalin and the Soviet Union's intentions. In early 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower arrived in London to take command of American forces and prepare for the invasion. Within a few months, over 1 million American soldiers were training along England's southern coast for the invasion. The invasion of France, called Operation Overlord, or better known as D-Day, surprised the Germans. Eisenhower was able to fool Hitler's generals into believing the invasion would come along the French-Belgium border. Instead, the landing took place 200 miles south of that, at Normandy. Airborne forces were dropped behind the enemy lines during the night, while planes and battleships pounded the coastal defenses. Then at dawn on June 6, 1944, better known as D-Day, the invasion fleet of some 4,000 ships carrying over 150,000 men, about 70,000 of those were American troops, began filling the horizon off the Normandy coast. Overhead, thousands of Allied planes supported the invasion force. This was the largest amphibious landing in history. The troops dug in at the Utah and Omaha beaches for some very fierce fighting. Nearly 1,000 men drowned before they could even reach the beaches. And in just 10 minutes, 197 of a 205-man rifle company were killed or wounded. That's how fierce the fighting was. By nightfall, the bodies of some 4,400 Allied soldiers were strewn across Normandy's beaches. The German losses were even greater. Entire units were decimated. Operation Overlord was the greatest military invasion in the annals of warfare and the climactic battle of World War II. With the beachhead secured, the Allied leaders knew that victory was now within their grasp. Within 2 weeks after D-Day, the Allies had landed 1.5 million troops and thousands of tons of military supplies. Allied troops were finally able to liberate Paris by August 1944, and Hitler's forces retreated toward the German border by September 1944. Most of France and Belgium by this time were cleared of enemy troops. After a quick sweep across France, the Allies lost momentum in the fall of 1944. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched a surprise attack in the rugged Ardennes forest, where the Allied line was the thinnest. The Allied lines bulged, but they didn't break under the German counterattack, and this is what gave the battle its name. It's called the Battle of the Bulge. And during this attack, the situation was very desperate for American troops, in particular at Bastogne. The American troops at Bastogne held out for 6 days, battling intense cold weather and enemy attacks. Finally, Allied air power was able to reinforce these troops. The destruction of Hitler's last reserve units at the Battle of the Bulge left open the door to Germany's heartland. Western offensives began in February 1945, and Allied forces were able to cross the Rhine River into Germany. By this time, the Soviet offensive on the Eastern Front had also reached the German border. So now let's look at the diplomacy among the Allies during the war. Now keep in mind that even though the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union are allied in their fight to defeat Germany, there's much distrust between them, and particularly the Americans and the British do not trust the Soviets and vice versa. Now let's look at the diplomacy among the Allies during the war. Keep in mind that even though the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union are allied in the fight to defeat Germany, there's still much distrust between them. As the final offensives against Germany got underway, the Big Three leaders met again in early February 1945 at Yalta, which was a resort in southern Russia. While the focus at Tehran in 1943 had been on wartime strategy, the leaders now discussed the shape of the post-war world. Stalin was self-confident and very demanding. He knew that the Soviets' control of key areas ensured that his demands would be met. There were two aims that dominated President Roosevelt's thinking at Yalta. One was the need to ensure that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan. The other was to fix the mistakes that were made after World War I in terms of the failure of the United States to join the League of Nations. The Yalta meeting thus began by calling for a conference to create a new world organization called the United Nations. It would contain a General Assembly in which every member would be represented. It would also have a Security Council with permanent representatives of the five major powers. Those included the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, France, and China. As Hitler's Third Reich was coming to its end, the leaders at Yalta had to make arrangements for a post-war governance of Germany. The war map dictated the basic patterns of the occupation zones. The Soviet Union would control eastern Germany. The Western Allies would control the western portion of Germany. The national capital of Berlin, isolated within the Soviet zone, would be jointly occupied. Churchill and Roosevelt insisted that liberated France receive a zone along its border with Germany, and also one in Berlin. The Russians also demanded for reparations of $20 billion to the Allies, half of which would go to the Soviet Union. This was referred to a reparations commission, and the commission never really reached an agreement, although the Soviets took an untold amount of German machinery and equipment from their occupation zone. With respect to Eastern Europe, where Soviet forces were advancing, there was little the Western Allies could do to influence the events. Poland had become the main focus of Western concern. Britain and France had gone to war in 1939 to defend Poland, and now, 6 years later, the course of the war had left Poland's fate in the hands of the Soviets. At Yalta, the Big Three promised to sponsor free elections, democratic governments, and constitutional safeguards of freedom throughout Europe. Yet these elections never took place in Eastern Europe. Russia, who had been twice invaded by Germany in the 20th century, was determined to create a buffer zone between itself and the German state. Critics later attacked the Yalta Agreement for giving Eastern Europe over to the Soviet domination. Yet the course of the war, not personal diplomacy, tended to shape the actions at Yalta. The Soviets, as a matter of fact, had the upper hand in Eastern Europe. By the spring of 1945, the collapse of Nazi resistance was imminent, but unfortunately, President Roosevelt didn't live to see it. Throughout 1944, his health had been declining, and on April 12, 1945, he died. Hitler's Germany collapsed less than a month later. The Allied armies rolled up almost unopposed to the Elbe River, where they met advanced detachments of the Soviet Army on April 25, 1945. Just days later, Italian partisans captured and brutally killed Mussolini as he tried to escape. In Berlin, which was under siege by the Soviets, Hitler married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, in his underground bunker. They both then committed suicide. On May 8, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender, and there were massive victory celebrations of what was called VE Day that erupted throughout the world. VE, of course, stands for Victory in Europe. However, the discovery of numerous death camps that Hitler had used to murder some 6 million Jews tempered quite a bit of the celebration. As Allied troops had advanced into Poland and into Germany in the spring of 1945, they came face to face with Hitler's so-called final solution for the Jewish population. In the extermination camps, 6 million Jews had been put to death, along with 6 million Poles, Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, and others deemed as undesirables. Hitler blamed the Jews for all of Germany's problems. He usually referred to the Jews as parasites, meaning that since they had no country of their own, they would attach themselves to other countries and basically suck the life out of that country. He also blamed the Jews for Germany's defeat in the First World War. Germany, however, was not the only place where anti-Semitism existed. The Jews had been targets of discrimination and violence for decades. The Nazi persecution of the German Jews in the 1930s was widely known in the United States, but when Jews began to flee Europe, the U.S. refused to relax its strict immigration laws to take them in. For instance, in 1939, when the SS St. Louis, a German ocean liner with nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees aboard, sought permission from President Roosevelt to dock at an American port, the president refused. Unable to find a port to take the refugees, the ship was forced to turn around and go back to Germany. American officials, along with those of most other nations, continued this exclusionist policy during World War II as the Nazi regime extended its control over millions of Eastern European Jews. As news of the Nazi atrocities filled government files during the war years, American officials futilely attempted to persuade Latin American countries to accept refugees. The Americans also approached the British to open up Palestine for the Jews to settle. Palestine, which was the biblical homeland of the Jews, had been administered by Great Britain as a League of Nations mandate since World War I. The General Assembly of the United Nations eventually created two states after the war, one Arab and one Jewish, and then Israel would become a nation in May 1948. But during the war, when evidence continued to mount that Hitler intended to exterminate Jews, the British and the American representatives met several times, once in Bermuda in April 1943, but they couldn't come up with any kind of solution. They were facing a very strange predicament, the Western Allies were. If they bombed the concentration camps, there was a possibility that Jews would be killed in the bombing raids. There was also a possibility that because the camps were so deep inside Germany, that pilots would run out of fuel or be shot down over Germany. The Allies could bomb the rail lines, keeping the Germans from transporting Jews by rail to the concentration camps, but Germans demonstrated repeatedly that they would simply march the Jews off to the camps. So to the Allies, it seemed that not much could be done but to win the war as quickly as possible in order to liberate these camps. Early in 1944, Roosevelt created a War Refugee Board, which set up refugee camps in Europe, and it ended up saving thousands of lives. But many historians still criticize American officials for waiting too long to act, and they believe that a huge opportunity was missed to destroy the gas chambers at Auschwitz in Poland. Germany was now under Allied control, but in the Pacific, the war continued on. American strategy in the Pacific was to so-called island hop toward Japan. During the summer and fall of 1942, an American offensive at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands gave troops their first taste of jungle warfare. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur landed at Leyte Gulf to reclaim the Philippines for the United States. Early in 1945, both sides suffered heavy losses at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Japanese pilots made kamikaze attacks on U.S. warships. That is, they would just fly their planes directly into the U.S. ships. Hoping to avoid a humiliating unconditional surrender, Japanese leaders refused to admit defeat. They hung on while U.S. bombers leveled their cities. In one attack on Tokyo on May 23, 1945, U.S. planes dropped napalm-filled bombs, that is, almost like liquid fire. Water could not put it out. The napalm bombs engulfed the city of Tokyo in a chemically induced firestorm, and more than 80,000 people died. Now, if you remember in a previous lecture, back in 1939, German physicist Albert Einstein called President Roosevelt's attention to the power of atomic energy. Einstein had warned that the Germans were very close to developing an atomic bomb. So Roosevelt ordered a secret government research project, codenamed the Manhattan Project, to work on developing an atomic bomb. The project was so top secret that when Roosevelt died in April 1945, his Vice President Harry S. Truman was not even aware of the project. Thrust into the presidency during a very crucial time, Truman faced enormous decisions. On July 25, 1945, President Truman ordered the atomic bomb dropped if Japan did not surrender by August 3rd. Truman believed that the atomic bomb would save lives by avoiding an American invasion of Japan. The ferocious Japanese defense of Okinawa had convinced American military planners that an amphibious invasion itself of Japan would cost as many as 250,000 Allied casualties. Moreover, some 100,000 Allied prisoners of war being held in Japan would most likely be executed if an invasion was launched. On July 26, 1945, the heads of the American, British, and Chinese government issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding that the Japanese surrender or face, quote, prompt and utter destruction. The deadline passed, and on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, on Hiroshima, a major Japanese war industry center. Close to 80,000 people were killed in the initial blast, and by the end of the year, the death toll had reached 140,000 as the effects of radiation burns took their toll. Additionally, 70,000 buildings were destroyed, and 4 square miles of the city was reduced to rubble. American planes continued their conventional bombing and scattered leaflets all over Japan, warning of the same fate as Hiroshima unless they surrendered. Truman and his allies, frustrated by the stubborn refusal of the Japanese military and political leaders to surrender, ordered a second atomic bomb to be dropped. On August 9, 1945, another atomic bomb called Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki, which was a shipbuilding and a torpedo center in Japan. Over 30,000 were killed in the initial blast. That night, the Japanese emperor urged his cabinet to surrender on the sole condition that he remain a sovereign. And the next day, the U.S. government announced that it was willing to let the emperor keep his throne, but under the authority of an Allied supreme commander. So on September 2, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur and other Allied representatives accepted Japan's formal surrender on board the battleship Missouri. Thus ended the most deadly conflict in human history. One estimate has it that 70 million fought in the war, at a cost of some 50 million and civilian dead, including those murdered in Nazi concentration camps. World War II had served to transform American life. Mobilization for war stimulated a phenomenal increase in productivity and brought full employment, thus ending the Great Depression and laying the foundation for an era of unprecedented prosperities. New technologies and products developed for military purposes, such as radar, computers, electronics, plastics and synthetics, jet engines, rockets, and atomic energy, began to transform the private sector as well. New opportunities for African Americans and other minorities, as well as for women, set in motion the changes that would culminate in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the feminist movement of the 1970s. Economically and militarily, the United States emerged as the strongest nation on earth.